And good afternoon. Welcome to the session on privacy and security, which showcases the diverse interdisciplinary research on the topic that's conducted by HCIL scholars. Live captioning is available for the session. The CART service can be enabled by selecting the closed captioning feature located on the bottom bar within the Zoom webinar to enable live captioning within Zoom or on your own device by selecting the link that you will find in chat. Also, please join us on the Discord server. Our channel is #privacy-and-security. We'll be fielding most of our questions and having some lively back channel conversation over there. Hope you can join us. We have 5 really interesting talks that are lined up today, each with about 15 minutes. We've asked speakers to have about a 10-minute presentation overviewing their projects, so we'll leave time for 3 or 4 questions at the end of each session. We'll be a small enough room, we'll be able to probably have people unmic to do those questions. So to get us started, our first speaker today will be Julie Haney, and I will pass the baton over and welcome her.
Hi, thanks so much. Can everyone see my slides?
Yes, looks good.
Great, fantastic. Thanks so much. My name is Julie Haney. I am from the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and I'm going to be talking about some takeaways from research into the approaches of security awareness professionals. And this was research that I did in collaboration with Wayne Lutters, who you all just met. So organizations can be especially hard hit by cyber attacks, yet employees continue to make less than stellar security decisions that put themselves and their organizations at risk. So orienting an entire organization towards security practices is an important but non-trivial undertaking. And a starting point in this is security awareness training, which is really twofold. So the awareness piece educates employees about security issues and aims to change their attitudes about the importance of security, while the training piece gives employees the skills and the tools they need to practice good security hygiene. Now, there are various public and private sectors that mandate annual security awareness training. So for example, the US government and the EU's GDPR also require similar training for organizations. And so these mandates really establish this minimum baseline with the hope that compliance to these will result in some kind of long-term positive impacts on employee security behaviors. But does compliance-based training really live up to its promise? So organizations that tend to take a very strict compliance-based sort of check the box type of mentality when it comes to security awareness have encountered several issues. So first of all, annual training often gets a bad reputation from employees, and it can be viewed as very boring, kind of death by PowerPoint or click-through computer-based training that's with the same content every year. Second, organizations might pay little attention to who they appoint to take on awareness training responsibilities. So security awareness professionals are often taken directly from the technical security ranks to perform these duties on a part-time basis. And some may have little understanding of how to actually go about facilitating behavior change, and they might be given insufficient guidance or resources. And finally, if success is measured solely based on training completion rates, this can reveal very little about how effective the training is in actually changing and sustaining security attitudes and behaviors. And so this presentation is really based on several research efforts over the past 4 years or so. So we started several years ago by conducting an interview study of a group of security professionals that we call cybersecurity advocates. And these are folks who are out there promoting, educating about, and facilitating the adoption of security best practices. And we wanted to really better understand the work practices of these professionals and what skills are required for their role. And security awareness professionals are a type of security advocate, and we did interview several of those in that study. We then followed up the self-report study with a case study to better observe security advocacy in practice. And so over the course of the year, we studied a security awareness team and a US government agency. And our findings from this study really corroborated many of the findings in our more diverse interview study. Most recently, my group at NIST is conducting mixed methods research to better understand US government security awareness programs. And although this research was not incorporated into the paper that I'm really presenting today, so far our preliminary analysis has really validated the findings from the previous two studies. So I'm going to spend the rest of the presentation talking about practitioner-focused recommendations resulting from our research, particularly related to how organizations can move from this compliance mentality and take their security awareness programs to the next level. And so this really involves helping employees move toward intrinsic motivation, where they see the value of security, they feel a sense of ownership, and then they actually practice good behaviors. So to be effective, security awareness professionals have to view themselves not as just as compliance managers, but as security advocates. And advocacy really necessitates a different set of competencies beyond technical skills. So for example, interpersonal skills, communication skills, and creativity. And the security awareness team also should have a good understanding of their audience's context so that they can tailor their security awareness communications and be able to translate these highly technical concepts into a language best understood by the workforce. So for example, one of our interview participants said, if you're a computer scientist and all you know is the computer science and you don't have the empathy, you don't have the skills to listen, you don't have that psychological side, I don't think you can make it work. Employees also need a reason to care about security. And so training should communicate the business value of security best practices to the organization. So how that enables the mission, how you can go about protecting assets and reputation. And this can be especially important for gaining management buy-in. So employees will also be more apt to thoughtfully make security decisions when they have a sense of personal responsibility and view security as relevant to their daily work duties. Also, to increase a sense of relevancy, security communications should be topical, whether that be related to hot topics in the news or pressing organizational issues or even seasonal activities. And then finally, a trend that we're seeing more and more in security awareness is an increasing emphasis on the work-home connection, especially in the current environment of increasing telework. So good security habits are much easier to form when they permeate someone's entire life and don't just end when they stop working for the day. So a lot of security awareness programs are now moving toward giving their employees information that they can take home to educate their families. Security awareness professionals also really need to get employees' attention. So many of them are moving beyond just doing kind of the once and done annual training and beginning to present security information and reinforce that information throughout the year using a variety of different communication channels. So for example, we've seen organizations hold speaker events, security information fairs, do handouts and posters. Whatever the media, the approach should really pique interest. It should be tailored to the culture of the organization, be memorable, and even when appropriate, it can be entertaining. So one of our security awareness professionals that we talked to said, you want to just put a different spin on it because people just see this stuff all the time. Be creative and think outside the box. And so in our studies, we've definitely seen some creative approaches. For example, a security themed food truck event in which people, while they're standing in line waiting to order, engaged in security trivia and games. And my favorite is the Shakespeare-themed play entitled To Send or Not to Send that educated employees about proper email usage. So simply raising awareness may not actually lead to behavior change. We need to also provide employees with the appropriate tools and guidance to empower them to be able to take action on their own. And so as not to overwhelm employees, recommendations should really be prioritized, practical and achievable given their skill levels, and described in easy to understand terms. So really focusing on the small steps that can make a big impact. And speaking of impact, security awareness professionals also need to determine if their efforts are actually making a real impact. And this can be very challenging for them. So compliance metrics only tell part of the story. So some other examples of things that organizations did is they look at the attendance of security awareness events, and not just focusing on how many people attend, but who attends. And that can help them identify potentially groups of people that they need to do better at reaching. A lot of organizations also get a lot of feedback from the employees, whether that be informal or more formal via things like surveys. And also they look at user-generated security incidents within the organization. So after training, how are security incident trends actually affected? And not just focusing on the negative, but also the positive behavior. So for example, are employees reporting more incidents? And so these meaningful measures really require a holistic approach in which data is aggregated from multiple sources. But most organizations haven't reached this level of maturity. It's very, it can be very challenging for them. A lot of times they just don't have the resources to do it. And it also requires a very strong relationship with other security groups within the organization so they can share that information back and forth. And then finally, to be useful, the measures have to be contextualized within the organization. So for example, if there's a particular group more susceptible to certain incidents, it might necessitate the development of more focused training for them. Finally, we saw that a lot of organizations focus on penalties when employees don't complete their training or they make mistakes. But research has really shown that the threat of negative consequences has limited impact on long-term security behaviors. And so positive reinforcement can be more effective. Some organizations are using incentive or reward programs to recognize employees who make good security decisions, and sometimes a simple but personal thank you can be quite effective. And so in summary, compliance doesn't tell the whole story, and so organizations should really strive to go beyond a compliance mentality and focus on engaging and empowering their workforce to be responsible cyber citizens no matter where they are. And with that, I thank you, and I'm open to questions. And there is the citation for the article upon which this presentation is based.
Excellent, Julie, thank you very much. And a reminder that there's also a Medium article that goes along with almost everything in the session that provides a high-level overview of some of these findings. So any questions for Julie, feel free to drop them in the chat, or if you'd like to use the reactions button and raise your hand, we can identify you and unmic. We're a small enough room, we can be intimate like that today. It's a quick question to get us started. Julie, can you talk about the relationship between cybersecurity advocates and the divisions and departments that are responsible for providing security in an organization? Are these the same?
Not necessarily. Yeah, they could be. So security advocates are not just security awareness professionals, but they can be scattered throughout the organization. So for example, you might have a developer that is championing secure development practices. You could have executives that are big proponents of security and are constantly advocating that to others in the organization. You can have people embedded in different mission elements who are also champions for security. So they could be at any different level, you know, from executive all the way down to kind of the ground level staff.
All right, well, thank you very much. Appreciate the presentation. We'll transition on to paper number 2. Kelsey Fulton is ready to go. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much. All right, so great. Today, I'm going to talk about our work exploring the benefits and drawbacks of adopting a secure programming language with Rust as a case study. So to start, memory safety vulnerabilities remain a very serious problem. And for those of you who aren't familiar, might be wondering, what is a memory safety vulnerability? Well, it's a vulnerability in code that allows an attacker to access memory that they're not supposed to have access to. And this memory could contain potentially dangerous information, such as your passwords or user personally identifiable information. And as recently as May 2020, 70% of all security bugs in Google Chrome were memory safety bugs. And similarly, 70% of the security bugs found in Microsoft's annual security report over the last 12 years were also memory safety bugs. And overwhelmingly, these vulnerabilities are caused by languages like C and C++ due to the way that they manage memory. So how do we fix something like this? Well, we might imagine making a secure alternative to C and C++. And within the last 10 years, Mozilla and Google created Rust and Go, respectively, as secure alternatives to C and C++. And Rust and Go offer memory safety and speed, where C and C++ only offer speed. However, despite these languages offering a secure replacement to C and C++, they continue to rank significantly below C and C++ on IEEE's top programming languages list. And this list is measured with a combination of things like code use on GitHub, Google search hits, Stack Overflow posts, etc. So as we can see here, C and C++ rank in at 3rd and 4th respectively, where Go and Rust rank in at 10 and 17th. So we might be wondering, if Rust and Go offer such a secure and viable alternative to C and C++, why are C and C++ still outranking their secure counterparts? So in order to explore this, we wanted to know what challenges inhibit the adoption of a secure programming language, what benefits, if any, accrue after the adoption of a secure programming language, and what methods and tactics have been successful or not in driving adoption and use of a secure programming language. So in order to do this, we started by using Rust as a case study, and we chose Rust over Go because we felt that Rust was the better replacement for C and C++ in their traditional environments because Rust does not have garbage collection. And we started by conducting semi-structured interviews with senior software developers who either adopted or tried to adopt Rust at their employer. We recruited through snowball sampling as well as emailing people who appeared on Rust's official website as users of the language. The interview was broken into 2 parts. We started by asking people how they had discovered or learned about Rust, as well as when and why they or their company chose to use Rust or not. And then in the second part, we asked them some technical questions about programming with Rust. And then we followed up the interview with a survey where we recruited from various Rust forums and channels across the internet. And in the survey, we asked questions about their general programming experience, their experience with adopting Rust, both personally and at their employer, as well as the benefits and drawbacks of adopting Rust, again, both personally and at their employer. So let's start by looking at our participants. For our interviews, our participants mostly worked as software developers at large technology companies with more than 1,000 employees. They had worked in software development for many years, and some of them had even led large Rust projects at their companies. And for our survey, our respondents were predominantly male, young, and educated, not entirely surprising for a software development population. They were fairly experienced with Rust, and nearly half were using Rust at their job. So let's start by looking at the first research question in terms of personal drawbacks, and the second research question more broadly. So to start, let's look at the challenges and drawbacks of adopting Rust. And throughout the results, I'm going to discuss the interview responses in terms of number of respondents and the survey responses in terms of either percentages, if it was a closed answer question, or number of responses if it was an open-ended question that we then did analysis on. So possibly the biggest drawback of Rust is the fact that it's really difficult to learn. And this can be seen by one participant who said that Rust had a near vertical learning curve. Participants also noted that Rust was more difficult to learn than other languages. For example, we had a participant who said that they didn't feel comfortable with Rust until about 3 months in, and it took them up until 6 months in to stop constantly looking things up while they're programming. And just to note, these are people who were software developers for quite a long time. And so part of their job is to learn new languages regularly, and they were still struggling this much with learning Rust. So it really speaks to how difficult this language can be to learn. Possibly the biggest challenge of learning Rust is the shift in programming paradigms that it causes. Specifically, Rust has new security paradigms that developers need to learn. And one participant mentioned that, the new paradigms in Rust can be really frustrating for people who are trying to learn it and possibly, turn them away from the language. And lastly, participants mentioned that a drawback of Rust is the fact that it lacks some libraries and infrastructure. Basically, some projects, when they wanted to get started, they'd have to build everything from the ground up. So next, conversely, let's look at the benefits of adopting Rust. Participants noted that the safety benefits of Rust were important, specifically the memory safety that Rust offers. For example, one participant noted that the memory safety was basically the only reason they were able to convince their boss to use the language in the first place. Another big drawback or another big benefit of Rust is the fact that while you're programming, it's easy to find solutions to problems, and participants attributed this to good compiler error messages. For example, one participant mentioned that the compiler is really good at telling you exactly what's wrong, the good official Rust documentation, as well as the helpfulness of the Rust community. And then lastly, possibly the biggest benefit of Rust is the fact that it improves safe development in other languages. For example, one participant mentioned that once you learn Rust, you're one with the compiler and it never leaves you. And now they see all the horrible, unsafe things they've been doing in other languages when they're programming. So next, let's look at the first research question in terms of challenges faced by companies and the last research question. So employer concerns can be broken into two parts: concerns about adopting any new language, and then concerns more specific to Rust. So for example, when adopting any new language at a company, a general unfamiliarity with the language will cause some concern about adoption. Additionally, day-to-day business pressures such as deadlines can cause concerns when considering a new language. When looking at concerns specific to Rust, the number one concern, as we talked about before, is the steep learning curve. For example, one participant said that their company was worried about how they were going to ramp up programmers, specifically because Rust has this very steep learning curve. Participants noted that their employees were also concerned about Rust's maturity and maintenance. Rust is a fairly young language, so their employers were worried that, one, would Rust be around for the next 5 years? And two, would Rust be maintained over those 5 years, since again, it doesn't have a huge ecosystem and it's fairly young. And then lastly, participants noted that their companies were concerned about adopting Rust because they were worried about the ability to hire developers in the future. For example, one person mentioned that their company was worried about keeping the thing in Rust because if people leave, we don't have a huge pool to pull from. And if you combine this with the fact that it's really difficult to learn and you don't have the existing pool, this can really push employers away from wanting to adopt the language. So participants had several pieces of advice for getting a secure language adopted. First, they say that advocates need to demonstrate the value of Rust. For example, they need to show that Rust offers a measurable improvement over the language that you're already using. Advocates also need to account for the upfront costs of getting Rust adopted, for example, budgeting enough time to get started. And participants emphasize the need for advocates to be helpful and have a good support system. They need to be willing and able to help and mentor new developers, as well as possibly have an existing support system in place for new Rust developers. For example, a participant encourages advocates to try and have some good support for newer engineers. If you have someone on the team who can help bring them on board, that's invaluable. And lastly, participants emphasize the need for patience. Advocates should give Rust time and be patient because the memory model and the lack of object-oriented programming combine to make it really difficult for new people to get started. 99% of our participants said they would use Rust again because Rust meets its intended goals, security and performance. It provides high quality feedback. It has a great official documentation and a good community. Basically, we can use Rust as a model for future development of secure languages and tools. And as we mentioned before, Rust has a really steep learning curve because of its security guarantees. And it's possible that this steep learning curve may be turning people away from the language. So we could consider possibly flattening the learning curve by creating a version of Rust that gradually allows users to learn the very difficult concepts of the language. And then lastly, much of the cost of Rust adoption occurs up front, and then all the benefits accrue later. And if you combine this with the fact that there's concern about the ability to hire Rust developers, as well as the maintenance and the longevity of the language, these long-term benefits may seem too uncertain for the risk of the actual investment. So educators and security advocates who want to promote adoption might consider reducing this risk of investment by possibly looking for ways to improve the equation, by maybe creating a pipeline of trained developers, or building libraries to contribute to the greater ecosystem. So to conclude, Rust is hard to learn, but learning Rust is worth it because it improves safe development, not just while using Rust, but also in other languages. To promote adoption, advocates recommend that you demonstrate the value of Rust, you be helpful and have a good support system for new Rust developers, and you be patient with getting Rust up and going. And lastly, maybe we can consider an alternate version of Rust that gradually teaches developers this difficult security concepts of the language. And I would just take a brief moment to thank the NSF for funding this research. And with that, I will take any questions.
Hey, Kelsey, thank you very much for that. Yes, questions from folks. Feel free to drop questions in chat, raise your hand, and that'll allow us to unmic and call on you. Yes, Sonia, please.
Hi, Kelsey. Thanks for the presentation. I do have a question. Maybe I'm not familiar with the programming language, but what are the coping strategy with programming threats? Because according to this presentation, the company is not really adopting Rust or Go. So what are the usual mechanisms that they use when they have threats?
Yeah, so when considering security, there's like, it's a mixed bag, right? So a lot of places, and because I had a limited amount of time, couldn't touch this, they did pick Rust because it has some great security benefits as well as some other great things about it. But when dealing with like the idea of security threats, I mean, people try to code review and they try to have some mechanism in place to deal with that. But a lot of times when you're using C and C++, they're the only game in town for what they do until now. And so it's like, okay, we try to do code review, we try to do threat assessment, but at the end of the day, it's C and someone's going to do something like not use a bounded string copy, and here we are. So I think, I guess to like kind of answer your question, code review, usually some type of security team, but even then it slips through because you can see from the fact that there's vulnerabilities everywhere, and places like Google have 70% of their vulnerabilities being memory safety problems.
I see. So it's like a reactive more than like proactive measures.
Some places, some of the places we talked to did pick Rust because they were starting a new project and they refused to do it in C++ when Rust existed because they knew they could do it securely if they chose Rust rather than doing it in C++ and having to make the switch later. But yes, generally speaking, a lot of these companies did not start with their foundation of the language being Rust.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Opportunity for another quick question. Chat or raise your hand and we can unmic you. Great. A reminder, the conversation is continuing in Discord. We have some discussions with the prior paper already there. Sorry, Xingyang, please.
So actually, I asked this question through chat. So this is a very timely study, but it looks like the learning curve challenge probably is not limited to Rust, right? It is similar to adopting any like new language. So my question is how, like in your study, how specifically such a learning curve challenge is related to the security flavor of Rust? Did you ask, for example, some unique probably questions, security oriented or related to security? Thanks.
Yeah, so we did have some security related questions specifically around, I don't know how familiar you are with Rust, but the idea of unsafe blocks, how they were using them. Did they use them to escape the ownership enforcement of Rust? So basically, did they use this mechanism that Rust built in as an escape hatch from all the security enforcement of Rust? It turns out yes. But, and we also, when we asked them about learning the language, we asked them to compare it to how they felt about learning the other language that they had most recently learned, basically within the last year, to compare and contrast, like, is this just it's hard to learn a new language? And it turns out that people found learning Rust a lot more difficult than they found learning other languages that they were programming in.
Great, thank you very much. Do appreciate that. Reminder, conversation is continuing in Discord. Our next presenter in our session today are a team of students who have actually just graduated. And because they weren't able to be here together for doing the presentation jointly, they have pre-recorded for us. But Shruti is here, please wave, to handle any questions you have afterwards. So I will queue up that video now and we'll enjoy their research.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay,
and thanks for coming to our
Perfect,
session.
thank you.
And I just wrapped up my undergrad last week at the University of Maryland with a bachelor's in computer engineering.
And I'm Desiree, and I also graduated from the University of Maryland last week with a bachelor's in computer science. For this study, we also collaborated with Omer Akgul, a PhD student, and Dr. Michelle Mazurek, our director, who are both from the SP2 lab at UMD.
Today, we'll be discussing our research, which compares the security and privacy attitudes amongst different mobile and smart speaker platforms in the United States. And specifically, you'll see we'll be comparing the users of iOS versus Android users and Google Home versus Amazon Echo users.
Now getting into the original motivation for this research. In the past, mobile security research has been largely limited to the analysis of only one platform at a time. And this is often done for simplicity's sake, but it's not really clear whether there are systematic differences in the privacy and security knowledge or preferences of users who select between two platforms. And studying only one platform at a time could introduce important biases or miss important potential findings. So as we can see in this graphic, the Android versus iOS population might experience differences in their user groups if they are largely different in privacy sensitivity. And similarly, this is potentially the same with the Amazon Echo and Google Home user groups. But if these differences may exist, we want to understand them better and provide important context about the generalizability of research results.
So now we also see a potential variance between existing technology platforms that might create discrepancies in privacy and security attitudes with respect to user groups of these platforms. So especially when we see some platforms have been putting significant marketing efforts towards positioning themselves as more privacy protected than others, as we see in the news all the time today, it can seem natural to wonder whether users of one platform are actually or might be more security and privacy sensitive than users of another. And so this leads us to our main research question, which is, are there meaningful differences in privacy and security preferences, beliefs, and attitudes between users of different platforms? And so to answer this, we administered a survey through Qualtrics to a quasi-representative sample of the US population, comparing privacy and security perceptions across users of smartphone platforms, which we mentioned Android and iOS, and then smart speaker platforms, Google Home and Amazon Echo. We specifically chose these platforms because they hold the largest market shares in the US today.
Here is a condensed timeline of our study. After establishing our research question, we began a literature review of past research papers that were the most applicable to ours. So this included studies that covered a similar research question or studies that measured privacy and security attitudes. And after this, we were able to construct our survey using previously validated metrics from our literature review phase. But before administering our survey to our participants, we ran a few pilot tests on a convenience sample. And once this was done, this is when we began our recruitment process of participants. Once we were able to recruit participants, we filtered out any fraudulent responses, and we defined fraudulent responses as responses from participants who did not reside in the US or who failed our attention check questions. And finally, we conducted our analysis from the valid responses left. To answer our research question, we created a privacy and security perception survey on Qualtrics to analyze different characteristics between iOS versus Android smartphone users, as well as between Google Home and Amazon Echo smart speaker users. To construct the survey questions, we borrowed from pre-existing validated metrics that had been proven to be valid measures of security and privacy, and these are the metrics listed in the slides. And keep in mind, the Pew metrics are related to skepticism toward company data practice and knowledge about digital privacy and security. Also, moving forward in the presentation, we will refer to one as the IUIPC privacy metric, which stands for Internet Users Information Privacy Concern, and we'll refer to the other as the Pew Knowledge metric.
So here are an example, the example statements that we included in our survey for the security attitudes metric, or the SA6. And so the full metric consisted of 6 statements, which participants had to respond in their agreement. And so this was a 5-point Likert scale ranging from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And 3 of these example statements are listed here. So I seek out opportunities to learn about security measures that are relevant to me. I'm extremely motivated to take all steps needed to keep my online data and accounts safe. And generally, I diligently follow a routine about security practices.
Here is an example of statements from the IUIPC privacy concern metric. So the full metric consists of 10 statements, which use a 7-point Likert scale of responses from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And the metric is split into 3 separate factors. So it's control, awareness, and collection. And in the slides, you see examples of the 3 separate factors. So the first one is control. So consumer control of personal information lies at the heart of consumer privacy. Second one is awareness. A good consumer online privacy policy should have a clear and conspicuous disclosure. And then finally, collection. It bothers me to give personal information to so many online companies. And participants were asked to rate their agreement or disagreement with the following statements.
Now we're moving on to the Pew questions. And so this was the skepticism metric on a 4-point Likert scale. Again, participants were asked to rate, well, in this case, their confidence level with regards to the statements. So example statements were, do you follow what privacy policies companies say that they will do on your personal information? Do you promptly notify your personal data has been misused or compromised, and you use your personal information or do you feel confident that companies use your personal information in ways that you might feel comfortable?
And finally, here's an example of questions from the Pew Knowledge metric. These questions are all multiple choice and have various answer choices with one correct answer. So we assign participants a knowledge score based on the number of questions that they answered correctly. And here are a few examples. If a website uses cookies, it means that the site and participants would be asked to pick the answer choices that complete the sentence correctly. Where might someone encounter a phishing scam? And then what does it mean when a website has HTTPS at the beginning of its URL as opposed to HTTP without the S? We recruited 493 participants through Prolific, and Prolific is an online crowdsourcing platform. And we used a representative feature to obtain a quasi-representative sample of the United States population. And this representation this sample was fairly representative of gender, age, and race. We specifically chose the United States to avoid any discrepancies related to availability and popularity of different devices, as well as cultural differences that could arise from comparing user groups of multiple countries. However, our sample did suffer from some inherent crowdsourcing biases because while we had decent racial diversity, we lacked an ethnic diversity. Specifically, we had a lack of Latinx and Hispanic representation.
So now getting into our main results, and you'll see we focus primarily on our results pertaining to iOS and Android users. For the sake of time, we won't be getting into Smart Speaker, but here we have a security attitudes comparison, or our SA6, and we found largely no difference. So here we want to pay attention to the shape of this histogram. And so on the left, we have iOS users, and on the right, we have Android users. And this histogram shows on the y-axis the range of possible values for each scale. So as we increase or go upwards in the graph, we show more security concern. And on the x-axis, we show the fraction of total participants for each score. So if we see again at the shape of this graph, it's largely similar across iOS and Android users. So there was no difference here. I think you're on mute.
Thank you. So now this is a privacy concern comparison. So once again, the iOS users are depicted on the left and the Android users are depicted on the right. And as you go up in the histogram, you can see that it indicates more privacy concern. So once again, as Shruti mentioned, you want to focus on the shape, and the shape is relatively parallel across both user groups, which shows that there is no significant difference between these different user groups on this metric.
Now moving on to the Pew skepticism comparison. Again, we found no difference here. And again, on the left side, iOS users, and the right side, Android users. So as we look across both user groups, there's actually no difference when comparing skepticism that they have towards company data practices.
Now, finally, here is a comparison between iOS and Android users on the Pew knowledge metric. And in this metric, we actually found a significant difference, which was that Android users have more digital privacy and security knowledge than iOS users. So we highlighted the areas in the histogram where you can see the significant differences. So at the top of the histogram, you can see that more Android participants tended to have more digital privacy and security knowledge than iOS users. While at the bottom in the highlighted squares, you can see that more iOS users tended to have less digital privacy and security knowledge than Android users.
So overall, we found no significant differences in attitudes of user groups for iOS and Android towards security and privacy concerns, as well as skepticism regarding company data practices. So as you saw with our results on the histograms, this also shows that Android users are somewhat more knowledgeable about digital security and privacy. And we lastly, for the sake of time, didn't talk about smart speaker platform results, but the main reason is because we found no significant differences in any of our metrics for the user groups of smart speakers across Amazon Echo and Google Home. So this suggests that cross-platform differences are not critical in security and privacy research with regards to smart speakers. However, we do want to recognize that this still remains an open question, and whether this results for smart speakers do extend to other kinds of IoT devices, it's still unclear, and this result would only really remain stable as the market for or currently right now, the IoT device market is not as mature as the smartphone market. So as the IoT device market progresses, these results might no longer hold true.
Finally, we proposed a few recommendations based on our key takeaways from the study. When looking at future studies that look at users of technology platforms, deploying a study on only one platform might be all right for addressing a range of security or privacy concerns. However, if your study will be affected by technical knowledge, you might need to consider recruiting cross-platform representation or otherwise control for it. Because as we found with Android users, they tended to have more digital privacy and security knowledge than iOS users. Shruti will be available to take any questions now. Also, please feel free to reach out to us through the email listed on the slides for any further questions. And thank you for coming to our session today.
Thank you so much.
Great, Shruti and Desiree, thank you so much for that presentation. Any quick questions from the audience? Feel free to chat or use the raise hand feature and we can unmic you. I'll ask one question to get us started. So you used a variety of different validated metrics to build your instrument. A challenge are oftentimes there's different language and style in each of those forms. Did you find any problems when you were piloting this with either of your 4 user populations where you had to change the instrument to make it more standard?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. I think so. We struggled sometimes with also having the proper context. So a lot of these surveys, for example, IUIPC or other surveys that were a lot older, it was mainly for early internet users, or primarily people with desktops, especially the Pew Knowledge questions. they had a few questions that just were not applicable to our study. And so we carefully, I think the pilots definitely helped carefully selecting which questions were relevant specifically to our modes of IoT devices and smartphone. And it'd be interesting to see how in the future, as this market, even for smartphones and IoT develop, that these questions might no longer be valid, but it'll be interesting to see what new questions can arise from there.
This is a great start, and the value of seeing where sometimes null results are tremendously valuable.
Yeah.
You think there's a difference and maybe there really isn't.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank
We'll
you.
continue this conversation over on Discord. So if you've not joined, please join Shruti there. And I will go on to our next speaker, which will be Noel Warford.
There we go. Always got to find the mute button once again when you get started here. All right, just a moment. All right, so hello. I'm Noel Warford, and today I'll be presenting strategies and perceived risks of sending sensitive documents. Before I start, I'd like to thank my colleagues at the George Washington University Usable Security Lab, colleagues Munyendo and Aviv, as well as Ashna, Mediratta, and Michelle Mazurek, my advisor here at the University of Maryland. So imagine you have to send a document that contains sensitive information, like your social security number, to a person that you do not necessarily know, like a new doctor or a CPA. How might you do this? You could send it to them by email. You could use an online form or portal that they provide, or maybe you could upload it to a document sharing service like Google Drive or something similar. Now, when we consult the literature, it turns out that this is an understudied task. Now, of course, there's been lots of great work over the past couple of decades on end-to-end encrypted communication. The classic paper, Why Johnny Can't Encrypt, studied sending secrets via email attachment with PGP 5.0 back in 1999. But modern work tends to focus on the direct messaging use case, which emphasizes protecting message content over attachments, in particular how and when people use services like Signal or Telegram as compared to sending texts via SMS. This is not usually, though, how people communicate in a scenario when they need to send a sensitive document to a new recipient. So that leaves us with a big question. How do people send these sensitive documents? Since we don't know much about that, we broke it down into the following 3 questions. First, what methods do people choose when sending sensitive information and why? Second, are participants satisfied with their current approaches, particularly in terms of whether they offer sufficient privacy, and why is that the case? And third, what risks are people most concerned about when sending this sensitive information? To investigate this, we ran 2 surveys. Survey 1 was an open-ended survey with mostly free response questions with 60 participants that was designed to simply find out the span of what people were doing to solve this problem, which let us then create and develop some hypotheses to inform survey 2, which was a closed answer mostly, informed by those open-ended questions in survey 1 with 250 participants so that we could evaluate the hypotheses that we developed. So survey 1 was organized by some scenarios wherein participants would need to send sensitive documents, taking both from prior literature and our anecdotal experiences. So each participant was asked questions about 3 transmission scenarios, which comprised of the following 2 parts. First, a brief description of what the participant was sending and to whom, here mortgage documents to a bank, and then a list of the documents that the recipient required. So participants were assigned 3 such scenarios, and for each one we asked them, have you done this before? What method did they use if you have done it before? And if not, what would you use if you needed to do this? How satisfied were you with the privacy and convenience of this method and why? And what risks were you concerned about when doing this? So we had primarily qualitative data, again, free response questions for most of these. So we used open coding to identify the themes of these questions, which would later inform our questions for survey 2, which I'll describe in a couple of minutes here. So first we found the most common and least common methods that people used. And primarily when unprompted in survey 1, people said, I would take the documents in person, I would send them via email, or I would use an online form or portal. The least common methods, on the other hand, were sending them via literal physical mail or by using a document sharing service, again, like Google Drive or Dropbox. We also asked participants to rate their satisfaction overall with this method of sending, their satisfaction with its privacy, and their satisfaction with the convenience of doing so. And we found that participants were overwhelmingly satisfied with their method across all axes. Each scenario instance here represents one of the 3 scenarios with which participants were presented. So we asked participants to explain why they were satisfied or unsatisfied with the privacy of their method, came away with 3 main reasons for them being satisfied. First, their chosen method was inherently secure. I feel like this is a very secure way to provide documents. Second, the recipient's procedures and practices would protect their data. I would assume that my taxes are handled with the utmost security and privacy. And finally, the information will be received as intended. The transaction will work. They will get my information. Well, I know that the information is going directly to them. If it gets sent to anyone else without my permission, then I know who gave them the information. Note that this final quote also includes elements of the recipient protecting their data, or not, as the case may be. When participants were dissatisfied, we found 2 primary reasons that that was the case. First, the method chosen is inherently insecure. I am not satisfied with the security or privacy of sending this information over email. I understand that it could be easily accessible by others. Or the recipient may accidentally reveal their information due to their actions and practices. It just seems like a lot of information for a school to have, and I don't know how secure their system is. When asked what risks were associated with their chosen method, some participants, reported the following. A facility or institution misplacing, losing, or selling my information to a third party can be worrisome. How the place I give these documents stores or disposes of them, and not knowing if the information will be kept safe. These share one common theme amongst them. The data at rest at its destination is itself at risk. This appeared far more in the responses than any indication of the data being at risk in transit, which was a very surprising result for us, especially because most existing tools in the encrypted communication space are more concerned with the security of data in transit. So, Survey 1 left us with some pressing open questions. First, have participants heard of the methods that were less commonly reported, or were those other options genuinely unknown? Second, what factors are associated with more or less privacy satisfaction? And third, what are the reasons that people are dissatisfied with the data at rest, particularly at the destination? That was a very surprising result to us. Additionally, we were able to increase the robustness and validity of our results because the closed answer format let us administer this survey to 250 participants instead of 60. So I won't have time today to talk about the regression we ran to answer the second question, but you can find those details in our upcoming paper, which is due to appear at Usenix Security 2021. So Survey 2, which we ran to answer some of these questions, was based instead of on scenarios, on methods. So participants were assigned one transmission method that we asked them about from this list of 8 here on the screen, which were derived from the open coding of Survey 1's responses. And they were assigned one such method that they had successfully used at least once to perform this task. So because of our redesign here, we had some elements of both qualitative and quantitative analysis to do this so that we could do things like report the prevalence of different methods, perform my aforementioned regression on privacy satisfaction. Again, I won't be able to cover that today. And we also still had some free responses that continued to require open coding. So here's the protocol outline for Survey 1. Survey 2 was different in the following ways. So first, at the beginning of the survey, participants were asked, what methods have you used to send sensitive information out of the list that we provided? Apologies for the interruption there. Second, they were then randomly assigned one method they had successfully used at least once before. And with that method in mind, we asked them to tell us some of the context surrounding that method. What were they sending it to whom? Because we did not provide that scenario. After that, we then asked them again their privacy and convenience satisfaction and the risks that they were concerned about. So in Survey 2, what methods did people use? It turns out that taking the documents in person, using some sort of online portal, or sending them via email were the most common. and document sharing services, faxing, and sending them via direct message were the least common. However, these orange bars indicate that the participants were indeed familiar with all of these methods, even if they had not used them for sending sensitive information, which answered an important question from Survey 1. We also asked some contextual details about these scenarios, and we found that the recipients were usually official, banks, schools, or governments. We found that these recipients usually dictated the methods rather than the participants. And we found that when prompted for what is sensitive, participants were usually considering financial documents or documents relating with identity information, driver's licenses, social security numbers, that sort of thing. Further details on all of these can be found in the paper. In general, people remain highly satisfied with all of the methods presented, with some slight variation as shown by the blue bars here. This aligns with the high satisfaction that we saw in Survey 1. Additionally, we found that identity theft and financial harm were the most prevalent risks, as indicated by these orange bars, which aligns with the fact that financial and identity information were the most common documents being sent. Participants remained concerned with whether or not the recipient would receive the documents at all, much like Survey 1. Additionally, participants were overwhelmingly confident that they were not the major source of risk, as you can see. There is, however, no difference between participant perceptions of the data being at risk at the destination versus in transit when they were provided both of those options via prompts, which was an interesting distinction from Survey 1. When we just asked generally what are some of the risks, the participants unprompted mostly talked about those risks at the destination. So to sum it up, we ran 2 surveys to identify how and why participants sent sensitive documents and their perceptions of privacy and risk when doing so. We found that participants primarily use email, online forms, or take the documents in person, but they know about other ways to do this. We also learned that participants are concerned about the data once it arrives at the destination, especially unprompted. So I would like to thank our partners at the Department of Defense for funding this work, and thanks for attending my talk. And now I've got some time for questions.
Excellent, Noel. Thank you very much for that. Interesting project, looking at the maturation of this over multiple parts of the study. People that have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or raise your hand. Our first question comes from Samuel DeBella. Did any of the participants mention not trusting the institutions that were entrusted to send the data securely in the future, compared to the distrust of the data at rest that you mentioned? I'm thinking of cases where I've requested medical records or results only to receive them in insecure methods, like unencrypted email.
So for this particular study, we focused mostly on times when the participants were the one doing the sending to somebody else. However, we are working on some future work where we're actually asking about those kinds of things, especially where you've had some sort of difficulty or some sort of worry about those kinds of. So that's work that's on our mind, but this study was focused on the participants doing the sending.
Great, and another question. I'll ask one regarding their perceptions, right? So this was their satisfaction and actual use of these methods. Did you see any alignment between their perceptions of how secure this was going to be and the actual reality of how secure that process is? Were they satisfied with the right means?
People think email is great, it turns out. Again, some of those reasons for some of those particular methods is an area of future work. Again, we have an interview study that we're working on right now to sort of go into some more depths about the specifics. But I would say that the most common misconception is that email provides guarantees that it simply does not, especially in some of the free responses in Survey 1.
Very interesting. Thank you. Our Discord is definitely lighting up, so feel free to join Noel there as we transition to our next and final paper. So we have Nathan Reitinger will be coming, and this work is so in progress. We're actually not going to be able to record this for the session, so you'll have to take your own personal notes and join for conversations afterwards to get some more details here. So Nathan, the stage is yours.